This week on Snark Squad Pod, we're joined by Sari Riley and Taylor Benke from It's Radish Time to talk about the Netflix series The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. I am your host, Marines, and with me as always is my co-host.
Hello, I'm Nicole Sweeney, and we are joined this week by two very dear friends of the podcast, Taylor and Sari. Say hello.
Hi, my name's Taylor, and I have a YouTube channel called It's Radish Time.
And hi, I'm Sari. I work for Complexly with Nicole, and I'm on the SciShow Tangents podcast.
Taylor and Sari are joining us this week to discuss something that was actually picked by patrons in our Patreon poll, and that is the Netflix series, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which was adapted from comics of the same name, like very loosely adapted, I will say. I finished reading the comics shortly before I started watching. I was almost done reading them, and I got about 5 minutes into the first episode, and I was like, oh, is it like actually a close adaptation? Because it starts in a similar way. But then, so I like stopped watching so I could finish the comic, and then I resumed watching only to realize that this was totally unnecessary because it goes in a very different direction. So it's fine. I did it. But the Netflix series starring Kiernan Shipka tells the story of Sabrina Spellman that is a story that is very different from the 90s Melissa Joan Hart version of Sabrina Spellman. In this story, it's much darker, and we begin just before Sabrina's 16th birthday, and she is facing the decision of whether or not she will take her dark baptism and commit herself fully to being a witch and being a member of the Church of Night. And we watch her sort of struggle with that. Ultimately, sort of like a compromise is reached because as a baby, she was baptized both by the Church of Night and by a Christian church. And because she herself is half mortal, she's allowed to sort of exist in both worlds. And we watch her do that, watch her try to exist in both worlds over the course of the 10 episodes, up until the final episode when, in order to save the town of Greendale, she signs her name into the Dark Lord's book so that she can become a full witch and access, extra power, and also have her hair magically bleached and save the town of Greendale. A lot of other things happen kind of along the way, but it's mostly her kind of existing in both worlds and trying to navigate that. And she has some mortal friends. There are some witch characters who are trying to pull her over into walking the path of night, as they refer to it. That's our story.
I was pretty excited about getting to watch this and talk to you guys about it because I don't know if this is true, but this is how it feels in my feelings, that it's been a while since we've had a question where I could truly ask, did you like it? And I didn't know what other people were thinking because we all were watching this for the first time. As of this recording, this was actually released like 2 days ago. So we all binged it this weekend. Like, we're on pretty equal footing, and that hasn't happened for a little bit. So I'm super excited to hear whether or not you guys liked this series. Taylor?
See, I've been thinking about that the whole time I've been watching, and I don't know. I don't know the answer. The whole time I was watching, I could like hear Mari's voice being like, did you like it? And me being like, standing there with my blood dripping on the book, like, I don't know if I do or not. I think for me, I had weird expectations going in because this show is created by the same showrunner as Riverdale, which I love, but I will admit is a terrible show. It's bad. So I was sort of expecting this to be equally kind of like clumsy and awkward and just like terrible soap. And I feel like it wasn't as much. Like, it had a plot. There weren't as many lines of dialogue that just like made me cringe. And like, I think it was trying to really create this new story out of all of this material that a lot of us have different points of contact with, which I thought those were really well done. But there are certain issues, and I think we'll probably talk about that later, that I think that they were trying to treat with a lot of nuance that made me a little uncomfortable. So Yeah, I don't know. Erring on the side of yes, I would say, though.
I would say yes. I liked it. I got the sense that this is something that future me will think that she liked more than current me did. Because I think I will remember all the things that I like about it and forget all the messiness that surrounded it. Because I went in with very few expectations. I liked the trailer a lot for it. And I was like, I love witches. I love dark stuff. And if this is Riverdale but weird, I can get into that. Like Riverdale plus magic. And I think there were, which we'll probably talk about, there were some things about the world building and the plot that I thought worked really well. There were some things that were really boring or confusing or felt like the writers didn't figure out the logic behind the world. And so everything was inconsistent, like especially when it came to death and life and things like that, where I think they were trying to do interesting things, but it fell flat in some places. So I think overall liked it. I can do a more nuanced critique right now, but later on I'll be like, no, I liked it. It was witchy. I'll forget what I didn't like.
I mostly agree with Sari's sense of the show. I think so far it sounds like I liked it most of all. I feel like I went in so primed to like it. I think it definitely has its problems. I think the first few episodes in particular were really struggling. The show really picked up for me on episode 5, which is the episode that they're in, like the nightmare for the entire episode. And from that point forward, I was much more invested. The first 4 episodes, I think it was sort of dawdling a little bit and didn't entirely there were things about the world that they just and its mythology that they just didn't think all the way through. I think until they started writing, I guess, I don't know. I'm making that assumption. I don't know. It felt as a viewer like they had kind of this vague idea of what the Church of Night was going to be, sort of in opposition to Christianity, and that was like the extent of the idea going in, and so they made a lot of like Hail Satan jokes in the beginning that were like excessive, and I think that it was around the nightmare episode that they started to be like, okay, like what is the actual mythology of this thing that we're making besides like Christianity, but opposite, like they finally started to think about what they wanted to do with their mythology. And that was the point where I started to really enjoy the show. It had some problems, but I really, really enjoyed the back half of this season, and I'm very much looking forward to the second season. I was about as primed as Nicole was to enjoy this, as that much primed to not, because we've talked a lot about like how everybody has their line of like stuff that is too much, whether it's gore or if it's like too much sadness or trauma or whatever. The occult is something that I like. Harry Potter is about as witchy as I can get before I'm like hiding behind things and like, oh no. So this was very, I didn't expect it until the trailer dropped. And as soon as I saw the trailer, I was like, this is going to be miserable for me. I literally invited 3 friends during the daytime to watch it with me because I was that amount of like, this is not something that I would choose for myself to watch at all. Like, no, thank you. Not today, Satan is kind of my media, like my media motto. Like that's the way I live. So there were a lot of portions of this that I was just like, I don't know, I could live without it. But that all said, I was surprised by how much I did enjoy parts of it because of that, like kind of preparing myself not to like it up at the top. But also the first half was a pretty big mess. I think just the pace of it was really, really all over the place. And I think the second half of the season did indeed pick up. And I think it helps that you start to get more invested in the characters at that point. Everything you guys have said about kind of its rules, its internal lore was a little bit haphazard. I think it was
I mean, not the, Satan parts of it, but the other parts of it were really cool to look at. The great costumes, like the setting was really dark and creepy and cool. So there were highs and lows for me here overall. And yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle. And will I watch season 2? Maybe again during the daytime, or if this podcast tells me to, is kind of where I am. So I don't know if this is like bias on my part because of where I'm coming from, but I want to hear more about your struggles with this show. So I know that I wrote down some things that I wanted to talk about and pick apart or whatnot. But so what were some of the things that kind of kept you at arm's length about this?
So I'll say, Mari, I have a similar feeling to you where, like, I actually didn't watch the trailer for this, and I sort of figured it would be, again, like, I just was expecting this to be like Riverdale but Sabrina, which I can handle, but, like, I do not watch horror. I can't handle anything even the slightest bit scary. So, like, had I known what it was going to be, I probably would not have, like, watched this on my own, except for I was like, I have to do a podcast.
Well, thank you.
I think that I agree with you guys in that it picks up a lot in the sort of second half of the season. I felt like the first 3 episodes were just like the jump scare episodes. And then they sort of like picked up like more, there was more substance, so they had to rely less on like there's a thing behind that tree, and then that it got a lot better for me because I didn't feel like I was like hiding behind things, and there was actually a plot for me to follow rather than just like I'm trying to like earn my creepy street cred here.
I felt like, so along the same line, I guess the whole part about like the internal lore confused me, because if I remember correctly of what like 90s Sabrina was, not that this has to be the same, but that was very much her learning about her powers. And so when you come into the first episode and she like kind of comes into the house and she points her finger and the music starts playing, I thought it was clear that Sabrina knows more about her own power in this adaptation. So she's kind of already a practicing witch. And like, so the whole thing is like, will she give up her mortal half? But then there never really felt like there were stakes there, because she still had power. She was still doing spells. And I don't understand, like, I don't know. There wasn't really a clear definition of how the magic worked. How do the spells work? What spells does she know? And why does she know some things and not the other? And like, we never really got introduced to like, here's how much Sabrina knows. Here's what she needs to learn. And if she goes with her mortal half, she'll never have powers again. And, some of that stuff was just a little hazy to me.
I don't know that that's inherently a problem. I don't object to the idea of it's magic, I don't object to the idea of hand waving over some things because it's magic and like letting that sort of be the thing. I feel like by the end, we got to a fairly satisfactory place in terms of answering those questions that yes, she already had magic. They sort of reached a compromise where she was allowed to more or less keep living as she was living, but like was going to start to become a little bit more of the witch community. And then finally the thing was, it wasn't just, she could be in both places, but by like becoming, full witch or whatever, she would get more power. And like, that's where we ended up. So I don't know. I think those questions were ultimately answered. I do agree though, that we weren't clear enough on where we were starting. But I don't know that those are specifically the questions that I had at the beginning. It was more just that everything felt kind of patched together in the beginning than anything else. And there were any like major questions that felt like they needed answering. It was just like, I don't know how all of these things actually like fit together.
I think for me, I agree with Mari about the magic more so than that. Like I think I would also give magic systems some leeway. In that they don't have to explain every little thing about it or how it works. But it felt to me like they changed ideas of what the magic could do when it was convenient for the plot. And that was a very difficult thing to grapple with in a show that is for a show that has magic as such a central problem and central source of power and central point of conflict for it. It was difficult to latch on to that when it was like Sabrina has to go to the school to become a better witch. So she has to be learning something, but she can just cast a necromancy spell with her friends by reading it out of a book and having the correct sacrifices or things like that. The fact that we were told that some things were harder to cast than others, when the high priest's wife had cast the spell to make Prudence the queen in the feasting episode, they said something like she was really tired because she cast a high-powered spell, but we don't see the physical effects of magic on anyone else. And all these kids that are supposedly students can just seemingly do whatever they want. We never see them in the process of learning anything. They can just pick up a book and cast whatever spell they want. And so I think that was harder for me as a viewer trying to be introduced to this world, because everyone seemed to know what was going on besides whoever was watching. And Sabrina would have been a really easy into that world, or her friends would have been a really easy into that world, but it felt like everyone. And I don't know, there were some moments where her aunts would say something and then they'd define it. Or Ambrose was a really good info dumper about the wizarding or the witch world. But yeah, there were a lot of either inconsistencies or just gaps in knowledge that made it feel messier and harder to latch onto
Right.
at the beginning and even throughout the rest of it.
Typically, I'm not like a big magic systems world, and this has come up before, but I don't know in relation to what. But usually, I mean, I like magic systems and whatnot, but I don't need to know too much. It can just be magic that exists. But I feel, and this is probably a really bad example because Harry Potter is full of plot holes as well, but at least they give him a wand and you know that he has to cast spells, and that's the way that magic happens. I feel like Sabrina pointed, sometimes there were spells, she's got to learn things, there were books. I don't know if we ever saw potions or anything, but you know what I mean? Like, there wasn't a clear, like...
The potion to put the brother to sleep.
Right. Like, this is how magic works in this world. And they don't, not that they have to tell us explicitly, but even as we're watching, they just kept giving us little additional pieces instead of, like, really solidifying anything. So that was one part that I was just kind of like, it feels like you guys are making this up as you go. And maybe you are.
I don't know. It didn't bother me. That didn't bother me at all. Because I think, like, not knowing how it all worked made sense to me, given that Sabrina kind of knows how it works, but kind of doesn't. Like, I think a lot of her kind of arc is her thinking that she knows more than she does and then getting herself into trouble. And so it kind of, like, I don't think we can know all of that. And then, like, I mean, there's certain parts that are predictable that you're like, something is going to not end well here. That becomes sort of the pattern in the latter half of the season. But, like, if we knew all the rules out front, then I think it would be a little too predictable. It'd be like, well, Sabrina, you didn't do X piece of this spell. And so, like, something's missing here. And I also, like, I don't think that magic always has to work in one way. Knowing a little bit of what I know about, like, other witchcraft stories or witchcraft traditions, it is not like there is always a wand or there is always a potion. Like, I think it was, like, a little bit more interesting than, like, kind of the classic witch movie where they're standing over a cauldron and there's, like, dry ice pouring out of it and, like, you know, green light coming out and, you know, whatever. So, like, they do all of the things with, like, the balls of string, or, like, they make the little dolls, and, like, I don't know. To me, it always seemed like we are showing you the thing that is being used for the magic in this scene, and you don't know how or why it works, but you're not supposed to because magic. And that didn't really bother me.
Yeah. I would agree with that, like, same basic feeling of, and also, like, in the fact that the point that you made about Sabrina's whole arc being thinking that she knows more than she actually does, I think that also helped it a little bit too narratively, because, like, obviously we're following Sabrina through this.
We mentioned the magic school a little bit, and I think that one of my other struggles is that right at the beginning, it had a ton going on. We see Sabrina's trying to decide what she's going to do about her dark baptism. We join her at her mortal school. Then there's this whole additional school, like, tagged on. Plus, some of her friends have, like, side plots going on as well. And I thought at the beginning it was a little bit too much, a little too convoluted. We get this whole introduction to the magic school, and then she spends, like, a weekend there, and we don't hear about it for a little while. And so I was like, wait, no, come back. Where's the whole entire magic school you guys have going on? So did you guys have any of those complaints about kind of how much it was doing, or did you enjoy it? Did it help the pace for you?
I thought the magic school was a little weird because, like, I think that all of the characters, except for, like, maybe Nick, I think was his name, were introduced to her before she went to magic school, that, like, she interacted with there. So, like, she would just go into the woods and the Weird Sisters would just show up and talk to her. So I didn't really know why they had to move her to this special setting where she was just, like, in weekend school. And I didn't, like, really understand how that would work, where she, like, would come and learn for 2 days and then everybody else would continue learning without her, presumably during, like, an actual school week. So, like, I didn't really think that setting was necessary to have her interact with her coven. I don't know. That it just sort of seemed like they threw it in to, like, make her, I don't know, to, like, remove her from her friends. But I don't know if that needed to happen.
Yeah, I think I got a similar sense where anything that happened in the witch school and to some extent within the other high school, I feel like the reason why those two schools were created and why they are in there is because, like, she's a teenage witch and this is her world splitting and she has completely different problems and friend groups to deal with in normal high school and completely different problems that seem higher stakes if there's this big hazing, harrowing ritual that she could die from in witch school. But it felt like it distributed my attention a lot more at the beginning. It was hard to know what I had to care about necessarily. And I think there were some moments that I really enjoyed. I think there were moments where the witch school was useful or interesting. Like, I thought, like, the ghost children thing was a little bit messy, but you got some character growth from Sabrina in that she is really empathetic and that she is trying to help people all the time. Mm-hmm. So I thought there were little moments that worked really well for me, but with both the witch school and her normal high school, it felt like I wasn't sure how many of these side characters to care about because a lot of them didn't grow a whole bunch over the course of the series, but they were given a lot of mini arcs around Sabrina as she occupied in both of those spaces. So to answer your question, Mari, it was like, yeah, a little bit too spread out.
I agree that it was too spread out, that it was too convoluted in the beginning. That to me, I think is like the biggest issue that I had in the beginning, more so than anything else that we've been talking about. Like, I think there were just too many threads and it like took a while to figure out what mattered. But I really liked the magic school. I actually don't like the magic school wasn't one of the things that I found to be a problem in that. Like, and I think the idea of her being split between two worlds and she's a teenager, and part of how that's going to manifest itself as a teenager is that there are two high schools. Like, that to me, I was cool with. But I think the show introduced a lot of the side character thread, like, arcs way too quickly. I think those needed to start making their way later, and we should have focused more on what exactly Sabrina's journey was even going to be, because like it took several episodes for that to become clear.
I did like the magic school, and I think that I agree that, you know, her split kind of existence made sense to have the two schools, but it was just, especially because I guess the pace at the beginning was so slow. Those first 4 or 5 episodes, they were hour long, but I swear to God, it felt like I was watching forever. I was like, oh, I don't know. It really started to drag on. And I think that at the beginning, when you don't have that investment in the characters, being spread out so much wasn't helping that cause. So it kind of had to hit like that midway point before I was finally like, okay, I care about like the 10 different directions she's being pulled in finally, kind of thing. Someone mentioned the ghosts at the school and kind of that being a cool story moment, but I don't want to be too overly negative up at the top, but one of my big issues with that whole thing, and I guess it's more of like an issue with how one of the characters is portrayed, but her like main opposition or her foil or whatever is Prudence, who is one of the she's one of the 3, I don't know if that's correct, actors of color that are cast in the main cast or whatnot. And so I kind of had an issue with the villain being the, you know, witch of color. And so, but it really culminated in that moment because Prudence is being evil and she's about to hang Sabrina. And at that moment, Sabrina turns it on her. And I don't know if anybody thought about the optics of Sabrina, a white witch, lynching the only witch of color present. And it really, 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 really bothered me. And I don't know. That moment was not great for me, especially because Sabrina's whole speech at that moment is we have to protect the members of witchcraft. I don't know. It was just very kind of tone deaf for that moment and what the optics of it was.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things that I think, we talked about them trying to deal with certain issues and maybe lacking nuance in some of them. I don't think somebody really thought that moment through and what that would look like to its viewers.
Yeah, I have that in my notes too, because especially because they spend so much of the series making witches kind of this metaphor for being some sort of racial minority or marginalized group where they're persecuted and there are witch hunters and they have, dealt with all this hardship and now they have to hide away for their own protection. And people call Sabrina a half-breed and opposed to witches mixing with mortals and stuff. But then so they're trying to make all of this commentary that really parallels conversations that we have around race. And then they did that. I was it seems like you were trying to make this this statement and then you made the opposite one by just completely not paying attention.
I'm trying to digest how I feel about this whole thing. I feel what you just articulated, Taylor, is how I kind of felt about a lot of overarching themes that they tried to bring up. I think that they were bringing in some really strong themes about sexuality and whether that should be demonized or not. There was a lot about just gender and masculine power versus feminine power and operating along that binary a lot where, I don't know, the head priest really wants a son or things like that, and showing that this order of witches is still governed by a male demon and they're still oppressing women in different ways. And a lot of Sabrina's, it felt, especially in the first couple episodes, a lot of Sabrina's stinger moments were when she was I don't want this devil to control my body, or said something like that. But those threads felt like they were picked up sometimes and then dropped sometimes, in the same way that you're describing with how they feel about witches as a racial minority. It's they felt like that was a big issue and something to highlight and a metaphor to emphasize, and then they would drop it or lose that thread or get lazy or do something.
Yeah, I think that there were so many points at which they were trying to make some sort of social commentary, but the way that they did it was just really confusing to me. One of her mortal friends, Roz, right, is a Black disabled woman who's slowly losing her vision over the course of the season. There's this whole arc for her where she's trying to get these books off the banned books list so that she can read them before she loses her vision. And then they describe her blindness as a curse. And I'm that's a very dodgy way to be framing this. Or similarly, there's a character who was sort of, I don't know if questioning their gender or not knowing how to talk to their friends about their gender, Susie. And then she gets visited by a demon that is saying all these slurs at her. Also, it's confusing because I don't know what pronouns to use around this character, because it sort of seems like they're going through their own internal journey about it, and it changes over the course of the season. But the demon visits and uses all these slurs that are thrown at trans people, and I'm just if you're a person who is supposed to be represented by this character watching it, I don't think you need to necessarily have that represented to you, and without any of the other side of it where it's celebrating. And then I get that we're dealing with a world that's has all this evil, but I don't know, if you're not balancing it and there's all of this talk about duality and light and darkness, and you just only throw the terrible things that are said at already marginalized groups out there, I feel that's not helpful. I just think that's clumsy.
That scene with Susie particularly stressed me out because the actor who plays Susie is non-binary, and so that was definitely a big moment where watching it, I was like pulled out of the experience of like just watching it and like thinking about the production side of things, because like watching that scene, like this actor had to do that, you know, I don't know, like had to sit through that. And right. I don't know what went on behind the scenes in terms of preparing everybody emotionally for that experience. But like it was definitely very uncomfortable to watch, and in a way that was not just uncomfortable because it was trying to make me uncomfortable, like uncomfortable for things that seemed a little bit not entirely intentional.
Yeah.
The people there, I was watching with a group, and as we were watching that scene, somebody literally said, I wonder how that actor felt during that. And so if you've created a scene where most people watching it are thinking about the actor instead of like the story that you're telling,
right,
you've effectively pulled your audience out, and you've done a bad storytelling thing. Like regardless of anything else, like you've lost your audience at that point. And I felt that way during that scene, during the lynching, and then, you know, in a show that is all about like magic things, I think I was almost, you know, impressed, but in the negative way, that they still made Roz's grandma feel like a mystical minority. Like she still had that, I don't know, like that mama, like mystical kind of feel to her. And I was like, really? Like you couldn't just like, you know, make her feel as part of this world that still had like a little bit of an othering feel to it. So I don't know.
Because they didn't tell us like how exactly she fit into it. Like that remained unclear. And like that's something that they could have absolutely clarified. Like they could have been either more explicit about like her being Christian, mystical, like that being somehow related to her power, or that like she was herself like, oh, you know, a witch, and like that's like how their family was crossed. Like there are ways that you could have done it. Like there are a number of very clear ways that you could have, with a line or two, fully folded her into the magic of the world, but they never did that. And she instead sat like you said, othered by somehow like the magic of this world. And I totally agree.
Yeah, there was some point where the one witch who was like trying to guide Sabrina into signing her name in the book, there's a point where she references Harvey as like her last connection to the mortal world, after we've slowly learned that like Roz and Susie are both having these like paranormal experiences. So that suggested to me like, oh, they're also both witches,
right?
Just like in different groups or different traditions. And I thought that was what we would eventually learn in the end. But then like literally they just have Roz's grandma sit there in like a rocking chair and tell her like, oh, you're going to get these powers, and then dies. Like it is so deeply magical Negro that I was like, you didn't even try. Like, oh, she's done just like giving this information. Let's kill her now.
It's hard to tell what the writer's goal was with these things. Like, right. Were they trying to create mystery and just not reflecting on how they were doing that, and how the choices that they were making fit into all these stereotypes or fit into all these. So there were a lot of times where it felt like these problems could have been fixed with a couple more lines or a different scene or something like that. Mm-hmm. So like in the case of Susie, having a scene in which they grapple with their gender with their friends or something like that, instead of just having all of the scary elements, all of the psychologically really intense elements forced in on them without resolving that arc in, I don't know, feel good kind of way. And similarly with this, like adding backstory to these side characters so they don't feel like you're just bringing in Roz's book thing, for example, felt really shoehorned in because they wanted to get in her blindness and they wanted to get in this superpower and shoehorn her into the supernatural in what felt like a very clunky way. But it could have been done better and more empathetically and more like making these characters feel less like stereotypes and more like fully fleshed out ideas and people with arcs and storylines and who matter in Sabrina's life and have an effect on this world. And we started to get that at the last episode all in bits and pieces, like how Susie was able to call upon her ancestor and knows from her reading that like she can defend people against these witches, or she has some sort of connection to the supernatural and is in that discovery moment. But it felt like too little too late almost. They had already set up these situations and these characters to be reductive plot points.
These are pretty hefty complaints about the story, and I know that we all mentioned, liking some elements of it. So I kind of want to turn the conversation now to what those elements were. What was it that kept you watching besides having to record a podcast, and what kept you interested in maybe checking out season 2?
I just really cared about Sabrina. I think all of the problems that I have with the show are related to so many things surrounding Sabrina, just like things about the world, things about the way a lot of characters are handled, so on and so forth, all the things we've talked about. But I like Sabrina herself as a character. I cared a lot about her very, very quickly. I think even in the beginning of the season, when it was like convoluted and messy, they at least had a fairly clear idea of who she was at the beginning. And I was just rooting for her, just wanted her to figure it out.
I agree with that. I cared, I think, a lot about the whole Spellman family. For me, they were the main draw and they were like the heart of the show, which makes sense because Sabrina's our main character. But I feel like Hilda and Zelda and Ambrose. I loved Ambrose.
Ambrose
he
was the best side character for sure.
My favorite. He's going to lounge around barefoot and just be in the background. Sometimes he doesn't even talk, and I'm happy to see him there, just lurking, ready to make a snarky comment when Sabrina does something dumb, or just have resources for her to do whatever. And so it felt to me like all of the Spellmans and the ways they interacted with Sabrina and the ways that they interacted with each other, they had such defined characters. They had really wonderful moments. And over the course of the season, you could feel them growing as a family and working through problems and working through assumptions that they had about each other and themselves. And I just, anything to do with the ways that they interacted and grew that was what kept me watching and what makes me want to watch a season 2.
Yeah, I think for me, like, I know that some of you felt differently, but like I felt like there were really high stakes from the beginning of like, and I had, I'd also read, I didn't read the whole series of the comics, but I read the first one and similarly was expecting her dark baptism to go very differently than it did. I was like, just waiting for Harvey to run in and get
murdered.
Disemboweled. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Wait, okay, no, so in the first volume of the comic, Harvey, the teacher, lures Harvey to go and show up at her dark baptism. The witches all murder him because he saw the dark baptism. And then Sabrina resurrects Harvey only at the end of I only got to the end of the first volume, but at the end of the first volume, like Harvey shows up resurrected, but it's not Harvey. It's Sabrina's dad in Harvey's body.
Oh,
that's
wow.
how volume 1 it's fucking wild. Anyway,
it was so differently than I was expecting because they sent her to the birthday party and and he's like, what are you not telling me? And I was like, he's going to go find out. Oh, Harvey. Anyway, I feel bad at how little I cared about Harvey, but I really, really cared about Sabrina. Part of her not knowing everything, I think, really worked for me because we had all of these different people from her aunts, and each of her aunts is treating her differently. Miss Wardwell / Madam Satan character, the high priest, the other students at the school, everybody is trying to pull her into sort of different directions. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because some of them clearly are they're all kind of in it to serve themselves, but some of them think they're doing the best they can by her. I think Zelda gets her into a lot of trouble but is trying thinks she's helping her. There are other people that are just trying to trade in her soul so that they can check the box on their to-do list from Satan. But then, like, Ambrose, I feel like is just truly just trying to help her.
Because he cares about her, just like genuinely, like, you're my family and I love you, and like, here's what you should be doing, or like, stop fucking up.
Right. And like, his character I did not totally understand, because he's like on house arrest for trying to blow up the Vatican, which seems to me like a thing that the witches would have been like in favor of.
All about.
But like, if that's like gets him to just be conveniently around whenever she needs him, you know, shirt unbuttoned to the navel, like, I'm fine with that.
Ambrose was also a favorite with our viewing crowd, to the point where Carol, one of my friends, she would, like, every time he was on, she would make like either like cooing noises or like, oh yeah, like he didn't even do anything. And anytime he was like near or around danger, we would all gasp and like, oh no, like, save Ambrose. And another one of my like little favorites, and I wish he had been on screen more, was Salem.
Yes.
Every time Salem came to the rescue, I was like, yes, beautiful, love that cat. I wish he had more to do. But it was one of those elements, too, that it was like, you know, one other thing that she was dealing with, the whole concept of a familiar that kind of conveniently appeared, and then we would forget about as we moved through the episodes.
Right, yeah. Like, there are times that he should have theoretically helped her and was, like, nowhere to be found.
Catnapping.
You know, he deserves that. He deserves some sleep.
But of magical things, I really liked the familiars, and I wish they had done more with it. Like, Ambrose with that iguana, I thought that plot was going to go somewhere, like, besides it just dying in the cage and things like that. But the idea of the familiar, I never watched the original Sabrina, but I like the idea that it's some sort of goblin in an animal form, and they seem to be super powerful, and everyone has a different one. Like the deer that was shot in the forest was a familiar, and that was a really neat touch of making something that could be mundane, that could be in the mortal world, supernatural, in like a really subtle, clever way. And I wish that there were more moments like that defied my expectations. I'm a human. I operate in this world. And then camera pans down. It's like, no, we're in Sabrina's world and there's magic. And the familiars were a really good way to integrate that. I think the first time Zelda killed her sister was a really good example of that for me too.
Yes.
And like buried her and then was chill about it. And then she came back to life and I was like, oh, this is great. Like this seems like a very cool rules defining moment. But then for me, they also lost the thread of life and death and how much it mattered and who you could resurrect and not. But I did like those moments when magic was used to, like, knowing the audience really, really well and knowing when magic could be used to surprise or amaze or draw you into the story.
Yeah. I think the resurrection rules, like, being a little bit wishy-washy didn't bother me. Like, I liked the fact, like, that to me was something that I liked, the way that episode played out, like the resurrection episode, that it was like that, you know, Sabrina thought that she had found a way to cheat it. And it was like, no, actually, like, you can't. There, you know, I don't know. That to me played really well. Yeah. And I think you're right that it is definitely, like, the show is not really clear about what the actual hard and fast rules are. That for me was a rule that my feelings were like, shrug. I think
that really worked for me. Like, I would have been extremely annoyed if the cane pit would have just like worked fine to resurrect what was her name? The witch that they killed, Agatha. Yeah. When they killed Agatha, like, and put her in the cane pit, I think had that worked fine, and then like, oh, we tricked Satan and we tricked death, which that's another thing, is like, death is the ground, death is an angel on a horse, death is like, there's so many different ways that death is personified. But like, I would have been really mad had she gotten away with that, because it would have been too easy. So I'm glad that like actually started to have consequences for her, and that it wasn't just a show like the 90s sitcom where like every episode has a problem and she solves it with magic, and like we think that that's gonna be a problem, but then it all works out in the end. Like, I'm glad that things started to catch up to her as it sort of built up to the end of the season, that like she couldn't just play fast and loose with this duality and like have it always work out for her.
Right. Yeah. I did really like that. Maybe I articulated it poorly. I did like the resurrection episode. I did like how that plot line picked up in the second half of the show. I think maybe where I was confused, and maybe it was just me, was people's attitudes towards death seemed like they flip-flopped depending on the plot of the episode. So, for example, the feast episode, there was a lot of talk about self-sacrifice, and which is, I guess, if you're eaten, then you can't be resurrected in any way. But people were either really for it because of it fit within the realm of the church, or really against it because you'd actually be losing your life. The way that Zelda kills her sister for when she's annoyed seems to be like a very flippant use of death. But then when Agatha was being sacrificed for a ritual against her will, then everyone was really upset and sad about it. In the way that I watched it, in the way that I binge watched it, I didn't have enough time to like sit and stew on each moment that someone was asked to give up their life. But it felt like the witches were one extreme or another, and I couldn't quite pinpoint how people felt about dying.
Yeah.
I saw an early review that compared this a little bit to Buffy, and I don't entirely agree with that, but one of the things that it did, or it has the opportunity to do, that I really liked was this whole like Sabrina emphasizing kind of like the teenager aspect of her witchiness. And I loved that, you know, surrounding that whole resurrection plot, Ambrose's speech to her, like, you just got here, basically. Like, you can't pretend that you know everything and that you just can challenge everything and everything's going to go your way. And I was like, but she can, because she's 16, and that's what 16-year-olds do. Like, this is like a worldview. Like, no, you know, there's something that I can do. There must be another way. Like, that kind of challenging of the status quo and what she was learning. I really loved that part of her personality. And even when I was getting super frustrated with not only her, but everybody's decision making, I was like, everybody needs to be a little bit more suspicious. I enjoyed that frustration because it meant that I was invested. So every time, you know, I was like yelling at Sabrina, like, no, don't do that. Like, I was like, okay, the story is obviously, you know, stringing me along in the right way, that I care enough that I'm yelling at my TV because she's doing the wrong thing always. But it fit in very well with that whole aspect of, like, you know, growing up and coming of age and the duality of her nature, and, you know, she's going to find a way. She's going to be the one who does things differently.
I totally agree. I think I loved, yes, all of the teenagery things. I think that comparisons to Buffy are a little like, the show is not anywhere near as like quippy. There's like some very significant tonal differences between Buffy and this show. I think it felt a little bit like it was aiming to be tonally more similar, like early on. I don't know. I really loved the like title, the credit sequence, like the, you know, with all the comic book imagery. I don't know. That felt like really misleading after watching the show, right? Like I don't know, like that intro sequence, I love it, and I mostly enjoyed this show, but those two things don't really feel like they go together.
I had the same note about the whole title, or the sequence or whatnot, and I went back and forth, and I landed on the side of, like, I get paying homage to the source material and, like, keeping that portion be very comic booky, but yes, it does not fit at all, like, the tone or the look of the show.
Right.
Like, it's almost jarring to go from the title, and then the next screen is like that dark retro horror kind of look, and you're just like, whoa, wait, that does not go at all.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, like, it also had that weird mixing of time. Like, I couldn't tell.
Yes. Like Riverdale.
Right.
Yes.
Like, where it's like they're, like, listening to, like, an old-timey radio or driving an old-timey car, or, like, all the buildings look like they're from the 60s and they dress like that, and then somebody will just have a cell phone.
Yeah.
Right.
Or, like, all of the witches are walking around in lace collars like it's, you know, like the late 1800s. I didn't understand where they were trying to be. And I think, like, that was obviously purposeful, but, like, I think that pulled me out of the story sometimes, where I'd just be like, is he talking on his cell phone right now? And, like, that didn't serve anything.
Cell phones aside, I think I liked that this sort of disorienting use of time here a lot more than I do in Riverdale. Like, I think in the way that Riverdale initially set that up, I was like, I don't know why you would do this. Here, I think it served a purpose. This is like such a, I don't know, not not really comparing like things, but I think in the same way that Maniac is like, also you're not really clear where you are in time, and it's a way of like, this is another world, like this is not this world. I think is sort of how that played for me. I totally can see why like that wouldn't work and why that would be distracting, because you're like, when are we? I 100% get that frustration, but for me it felt like a tone, a way of saying we are somewhere else entirely.
Yeah. I think I was like expecting like moving around in time to be part of the plot at some point. I think there was one like detail that I noticed in the episode with the banned books where like there's one scene where they're like they're looking at the cover of The Bluest Eye, and it's like a very old version of the cover, and then like later at the end of the episode when they start the book club, it's like the same cover as the one that, you know, I bought in college. And I was like, is that supposed to be relevant? Like, am I supposed to notice that? Is that supposed to be a thing that I'm picking up on? And I don't think was.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
So I think like the only thing for me, like, I kind of get what you're saying, but I think I was just like looking for something that wasn't there in it.
I think it mostly worked for me in the sense that I really liked that like retro kind of feel to the story in particular. I think it worked really well. There's a moment that at the beginning, Miss Wardwell, I think her name is, when she's still Miss Wardwell, she's driving along and she's like in her car listening to classic rock, and my friend Jess goes, "Oh, classic rock, she's dead." Like, I was just like, what? She's like, no, if she's listening to classic rock in her old-timey car, like, she's gonna die. So there were things like that I thought were really funny to, like, include, like, the retro kind of horror tropes and stuff to kind of signal different things. But it was the moments it was, like, mentioning The Bluest Eye by name, and, like, Harvey's on his cell phone and Sabrina's talking back to him on a corded phone. And you're just like, oh, you're, like, one detail off from being great, but not quite there.
You mentioned earlier that everybody should be more suspicious than they were, and I totally agree. And this is like such a minor thread, but I 100% expected Lucas to be the witch hunter.
Oh, yeah.
Same.
The way that whole episode where he gets introduced played out, it was like Ambrose is like, it seems like there's a witch hunter, you know, in our midst. And then like at the funeral, there's this like rando hanging around in the back who's like, "You're a witch, right? Wink, wink." And Ambrose is like, "Cool, I'm gonna trust you." And like there's the whole idea, like the fact that there was a witch hunter in general, like that was one of the threads that was like tossed out there early on, as this is like a big deal and should be the thing that we're going to worry about. And then they just completely leave it alone entirely. That was confusing, but also more confusing was Ambrose's complete lack of suspicion. I mean, he turned out to be right in this case, but also what?
Right. Like the iguana thing. So when he like spends the night at Ambrose's room and then disappears, and then the next morning he finds the iguana familiar dead. I was like, oh, Lucas killed it. That was an omen. He's coming for you next. And then we never hear about it again.
Yes. I think that there were several times that happened to me. First, I expected Ambrose to be able to keep the iguana. And I was like, oh, he's going to get a familiar. Then it ends up dead. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And then it means nothing. And there was another moment that, they, in the episode where they get revenge on like the jerk jocks and like they trap their like virility in a cage or whatever. So they'll be like, for a while, my friend Jess kept asking, yeah, but what about those impotent jocks? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know why that's the drop thread that you really want to hear more about, but
no, I was very not at all concerned.
She was.
Though that like did strike me as like a weird tonal moment. So like there's some points where you can tell that there's sort of like talking about the concept of consent. Like I think all of the stuff with the principal and like how his story ends is like because he's so creepy to the teacher, like because he's so creepy to people, and like that's why he gets killed in the end. But then like they have the punishment for these like jocks is that they trick them into like making out with each other and like take photos and like threaten revenge porn on them, and then that's like totally okay. I'm like, how is that okay? Like when one, like the people that we're rooting for do it.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep.
There were, I mean, and there, I think this is kind of what the show still has to decide or is yet to be shown to us, because the whole, like, Church of Satan thing and the way that it's, like, supposed to be, like, we're actually not so bad. We're not what the propaganda says kind of thing. We're not evil. We're all about free choice. But then they do a lot of, like, really evil things, like murdering people. And you're like, wait, are you guys good or bad? And I think there were moments like that for Sabrina, too, which we see her kind of go full dark, which I think might be misdirection towards at the end of the first season or whatnot. But she does things like the things with the jocks that you're like, what, Sabrina, especially when you're the one like on your high horse constantly about, what's right and protecting mortals. She makes choices sometimes that I'm like, girl, what? Is this like inner darkness, or is this what the show is trying to tell us about? Like, everybody has a little bit of inner darkness, but I don't know. It was a little to be determined to me.
Yeah, I think what you just said about, like, what is the show trying to say with it? It's not a problem to me that Sabrina makes a lot of bad choices. That's fine. And again, she's a teenager with all of this power. And so it makes sense, sometimes she's going to fuck up at, like, the idea of this self-righteous teenager periodically taking that self-righteousness in, like, to really broken directions. Like, yeah, sure. But when she does it, the show doesn't seem to respond to it in a way that recognizes that that's what she's doing. And I think that's, yes, like they need to get clearer on just what are you doing exactly? Do you know?
I honestly, as much as I'm, I don't know. I don't think the show knows what it's doing.
No, I don't either. I don't.
I think they had, the source material and the concept, and like Riverdale's doing very well, but I don't think anybody sat down and went, what are we going to say? Like, what are we trying to say? Like,
which is also true of Riverdale too, by the way.
Great.
Or it seems like they were like, we'll say some vaguely social justice-y things, but they didn't think about how they were going to say it, so they said it in an incredibly clumsy way.
But I feel like season 1 of Riverdale had a central mystery.
Yes.
And that's what this season feels like it's missing to me. It felt like they tried out like 3 or 4 different episode types. Like, let's try, what does Sabrina look like as a monster of the week thing? What does Sabrina look like as a high school sitcom-y thing where she's trying to balance both lives? What does it look like as having a plot point of her embracing this inner darkness and figuring out what does it mean to be a witch and fighting against this big bad, and having all of those things. Whereas Riverdale season 1, I was like, no, I'm invested. Like, this is going to go off the rails, but the murder of Jason Blossom is the thing that we're trying to solve. That I didn't have that thread to hang on to for Sabrina.
Which, like, oddly enough, I was figuring kind of the whole conflict was like, is she going to sign the book or not? But like, we're going through a tour of, as you said, like just a sampler of different ways to put together this show on the way to, does she sign the book or not? But like, it almost gives me more hope for season 2 in that, like, Riverdale season 1 was like, I think tight is maybe a strong word, but like it was contained in a sort of a way where it was like, there's an arc that's going from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. And then like Riverdale just went right off the rails. And they're like, well, now we solved the murder of Jason Blossom. Now we need a new murder every 15 minutes. And like, I think because I'm always concerned about shows that have a really tight season 1, because then they don't know what to do with the rest of the seasons.
Exactly.
Whereas if season 1 is a little slower, I think like then they find their footing, and then like hopefully, knowing that they have a season 2 already, like they can put that together as a season-long package that has a purpose and a direction. That is my hope.
Same. And I think the fact that they did the sort of like sampler type thing also gives me a good deal of hope, because there's a sense of, okay, we know, I mean, the thing to temper that hope is whether or not they learned the correct lessons. But like in theory, because they tried a bunch of different things out, they're now in a better position to know what worked and what didn't.
Yeah.
I was hoping that maybe the direction that they would go in would be more monster of the week with a like overarching kind of arc for the story. But because of the way it ended, I'm thinking they're going to go more magic school, like in that direction, which is fine. But I don't know. I think the ones that worked for me were when there was like some kind of monster and something that they were solving and that kind of piece of it. But we'll see.
I also would have preferred that they let Sabrina just stay in her state of limbo and then do like Monster of the Week. But I don't know. I liked that ending. Like there were, some things about it that were interesting. So I remain optimistic.
Did you expect her to sign the book?
No, I did not. But I agree with you. I do think that like there is probably some misdirection there. I think I would not be surprised if there is, I don't know, something else going on with that.
Yeah, I was really mad when she did it. But I agree. Like, I don't think that that's the end of it. And I also think that she had to do it because I feel differently about like her staying in limbo and doing the Monster of the Week, because I felt like already by the end of the season that was getting old for me. And like having her do she didn't know enough about this spell that she just cast and now it's going to cause problems.
It went wrong.
Now she's either got to go to Hilda and Zelda or Miss Wardwell to help her figure it out, right? And like have them keep trying to pull her in opposite directions. Like if there was another season of that, I would get really bored of it. I'm interested that they have taken it in a new direction, and I am hopeful that next season explores like what else there is behind her signing the book, because I feel like there has to be something.
I hope they pick up the thread of her parents too, because that was kind of sprinkled throughout this, and especially in relation to the book. I feel like they talked about her dad so much. The fact that she was baptized the day before, like that was the coolest part of the court episode for me, was learning about the decisions that were made for her as a baby that now she has to reckon with as a teenager. That's always very cool. Yeah. And so I hope that in signing the book, she now has to reckon with other things that either her parents have set up for her or haven't, or I don't know, uncovering more secrets about her past would be great in this second season.
More Spellmans, just in general, more Spellman stuff. Yes, totally. I appreciate, in theory, some of the things that they were trying to introduce with a lot of her mortal friends, but I think if now that she's signed the book, let's just do the magic stuff then.
Right.
Yeah.
As Sari was talking, I was mostly just laughing to myself, thinking about the court and how the judges or whatever were like pounding the gavels and going, disorder in the court. And I'm like, really? Like, now you're just saying stuff that doesn't make sense. Like, they're calling to order with disorder in the court. Okay, we get it. You're the Church of Satan.
I appreciate a lot of that stuff too, though. I think, but like that comes back to, again, just needing more clarity. Like I think I could totally get on board with a slightly more ridiculous version of the show, but because it never committed, it was just like it would do things like that, but then pull back from it too quickly for those moments to actually land and be fun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the unholy shit, that line like really pulled me out of it, because it just felt so forced. It was like, okay, what expressions can we make these people say and then twist them? Oh, I do want to mention that I liked the bookstore as their hangout, like their analog to Pop's Diner. Like Riverdale, you've got the little diner. In Greendale, you have this weird coffee shop bookstore. I felt like that was a thread, weirdly enough, that carried through really well, where I think Harvey was talking about maybe getting a job there, and his dad, who's an asshole in the show, was like, oh, you mean that one with a weird guy dressed as a vampire or something, or like insulted the way that the guy dressed and acted. But then when you meet him later on, it's like, no, he is dressed as a vampire. And then when Hilda works there, she dresses as the Bride of Frankenstein or something. And that's like their shtick. And in the very last episode, his eyes glowed orange, and I was like, okay, yeah, bookstore man, I will follow your plot too.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was a really nice, fun touch. And so honorable mention to, I don't even remember his name, but vampire.
Cerberus, Dr. Cerberus.
Yeah, that guy.
Also, speaking of that, like, yes, bookstore, diner, whatever type place, one of the reasons that I was drawn in pretty quickly, even though Sabrina's friends as characters are, meh, whatever. But like we begin this story with them going to see a horror movie and then like sitting around to have like to dissect horror movies and like have their media commentary friendship. I just was like, oh yes, good, beautiful, more of that. But then we didn't get any more of that ever. So.
Yeah, their interest in horror died immediately. Despite all these weird supernatural things happening to them, no one ever brought up like, oh, this is like that one movie we saw, remember?
Yeah.
I my one little thing that I want to add, we talked about the Spellmans, but I really was, enjoyed is not the right word, but I was invested and interested in Zelda and Hilda's complicated relationship as sisters.
Yeah.
And the weird vibe that they have going on and the way that grew and changed. I was not as into the way that they styled Hilda. She just always looked very awful. Just like her makeup was weird, like the whole thing. And I did not appreciate that for her character. So what I am invested in is seeing Hilda get her justice in season 2, living her life, her best life at the bookstore and falling in love, whatever else she wants for her life. I'm here for supporting that for Aunt Hilda.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit worried Dr. C is going to be the witch hunter, but
Stop. Wait.
But I mean, I also want that for Aunt Hilda, but I'm just like, I want to like temper those expectations.
We have to be suspicious since nobody else on the show will be. And on that note, that brings us to the end of another episode. Thank you to Taylor and Siri for joining us this week, and thank you all for listening. If you would like to support this podcast, we are on Patreon. As we mentioned, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina was chosen by our patrons. So if you'd like to help us decide what to cover on this podcast, check out patreon.com/SnarkSquad. We'd love to hear all of your thoughts on Sabrina. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also check us out on Twitter at @Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
I'm at It's Radish Time.
And I'm at C.E. Riley.
Thank you, as always, to Stefan Chin for the fancy theme music that is playing us out right now. And we will be back in your podcast feed next week. Bye.